Good morning, students. This is the story of David and how he established himself as king over all of Israel. If you remember from our last set of stories, we had David and Joab and Abner and Ishbosheth sort of in conflict with each other. And over time, Abner defects from the king of Israel and he goes over to David and he sort of sets an agreement with him, but then is killed by Joab for the death of his brother in vengeance. And now we're sort of in the next section, which is uh, we're going to sort of hear from the perspective of Ishbosheth. So Ishbosheth accused Abner of sleeping with one of his concubines, which in those days would be a sign of like sleeping with a king's concubine is essentially putting a claim on the throne. So Ishbosheth claims that that's what happened with Abner. We don't know whether it's true or not, but Abner then defects over to David, and then that whole thing happens. Now, when Ishbosheth hears that Abner has died, he immediately loses courage. Um, I think Ishbosheth understood that he was a weak king, and that he needed Abner's sort of political shrewdness and political maneuvering and abilities to sort of keep himself around. He also needed his right hand man, his commander of his army, to make sure that like he was staying safe. Um, and we actually hear from all of or from the Bible passage. This is 2 Samuel 4 and 5 that we're going to be talking about. That all of Israel loses hope. So when Abner dies, it's not just Ishbosheth that loses courage, but also all of Israel. And my sense of it, and I think this is a general sense that people get when they read this, is that the Israelites are concerned for what David's going to do. Because they know that Abner was so important to Israel, they're not sure exactly how it's going to play out in the future. So what happens is these two men get in their heads that they should act on David's behalf, even though David hasn't asked this to happen. They infiltrate Ishbosheth's home. The story goes that they went around noonday, so Ishbosheth was lying down for his midday nap, um, which is actually fairly common in other sort of regions. We don't really do that in Canada that much, but if you go to other places, they do lots of afternoon naps, like 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. It's a siesta in Spain, but so these men infiltrate the house and then they kill Ishbosheth. Um, and they think they're doing this because that's what David would want them to do. Um, but you would think of this more of like it's kind of like an act of terrorism almost, or like an assassination. Um, they do it because they think David wants them to have to do that. So what they do is, and this is sort of why we sort of get the idea that this is like an assassination or like that sort of terrorism act, is they don't just kill him; they cut off his head, and then they go through the night carrying his head, and they bring it to David, and then they proudly proclaim, "We've killed Ishbosheth on your behalf." Um, and I don't think they understand who David is. Um, they maybe have this. They may still have the story of who Saul made David out to be, like this outlaw, this traitor of the people, that sort of idea. Because clearly they don't understand what sort of man David is. Who actually just recently proclaimed that Jonathan and Saul, the death of them was a loss to all of Israel, and that God will weep for them as well, and all these sorts of things. So they don't really understand exactly what's happening. These Benjamites killing Ishbosheth, bring his head to David, and David rightly has them executed for their terrible actions. Um, so David has them killed, and then we hear this interesting consolidation of power. What consolidation means is when you bring things together, you sort of from a whole bunch of different ideas and areas, you sort of bring all those things together and you make it focus on one person. And that's what David does. Right now, he sort of has he has a broken nation. He's with Judah, and he's the king of Judah, and he's established himself as king of Judah. Um, and Israel is now sort of in disarray. And so what happens is David meets with the elders of Israel, likely the oldest men that are in positions of authority for every tribe, and he essentially comes to an agreement with them. It sounds like there's some sort of contractual thing written up or something to that effect, where there's maybe taxes that are being subjugated or given or not given, or there's some sort of agreement that comes to it. But David is essentially established as king of not just Judah but also Israel. So I'm just going to start referring to Israel as a whole instead of Israel and Judah. So David becomes the king of Israel, and he needs to sort of decide how is he going to not just bring consolidation of power, but also consolidation of unity. Israel is a disjointed place. If you remember from our stories, there's been fights between Judah and Israel, and these are men of the same like forefathers. So David has to do something that sort of brings the people together to sort of understand that they are on the same side. Now this disunity that we sort of witnessed before David establishes himself as king, it's something that comes up a whole bunch of times. Later on in the stories of Israel and Judah, or other stories of Israel as a nation, we hear about this constant separation between the two groups. And we can hear about like how there's later on there's actually two kings in Israel and Judah, and they're sort of at war with each other. And but there's a while there when Israel has unity, and that's because of David and the work he does, and also the fact that God blesses it. So what David does is he understands that there's disunity, and he had a king. He had a place where he was king, and he had a palace, or he had sort of where his throne was. And Ishbosheth had a location, and if he were to go to either one of those locations, he would kind of indicate to that people that he's their king. Now, the weakness of that is if he were to have a throne in Judah, and he were to set up his new throne of king of Israel in Judah, then the Israelites would feel like those are slighted, or like David doesn't like them as much. And if he was king of Judah before, and he sets up his throne in where Israel is, like northern Israel, then the people in Judah may think, well, David's like turning his back on us. So what David does is he instead decides to take a town or take a city that hasn't been previously owned by either group of people, and that place is called Jerusalem. Um, Now, Jerusalem's an interesting place. It's sort of in the middle of Judah, but more sort of to the northern part of it. So that's sort of encroaching on Israelite land. Um, and David chooses to take Jerusalem not just because that it's the central location and that neither group sort of has authority over it, but also it's a very excellent strategic location. It's sort of central Israel as a nation. It's in the central part of Israel. It's up a hill. It has mountains around it, and it's just militarily speaking a very easy place to defend. Um, so David's again using his sort of insight into military tactics and stuff like that, and sort of looking farther ahead. And he's able to take over Jerusalem. Now, the interesting story about this is at the time there was another nation that was in ownership of Jerusalem, and they were extremely confident in their abilities. And they said something to the effect of, we could defend Israel, or we could defend Jerusalem with like the lame and blind. That's how easy it is. Um, so what David actually does is he infiltrates it through a water shaft, and then sort of has like an attack force from inside and then outside, and they sort of collaborate. Um, but it's just cool to think about that David sort of goes around the problem and sort of solves it for himself. Um, After David becomes established as king, he has battles against the Philistines. Now, what happens with the Philistines is they hear that David is the king, and they think that this is their opportunity because of the disunity and because of the uncertainty and because of all these sorts of things happening. They're like, this is our chance to attack. This is our golden opportunity. If we're gonna ever take down Israel and sort of capture this land, here's our chance. And so they go to war with David twice. Both times they get completely routed. The first time David attacks them conventionally, he asks God what he should do, and God says, I'll give them into your hand. The second time, God tells them to circle around back, and then when he hears the sounds of trampling in the forest, then he should attack, and that means God's with him. But either case, God allows David to completely rout the Philistines and just defeat them in battle. David also starts having significance with other nations. We hear that there's an envoy from another king from distant lands that sends an envoy, which is like essentially you can kind of like think of it as like a group of diplomats that are sort of on that are going to another king to essentially build a relationship with him that's friendly. He sends this envoy has carpenters with him and a bunch of wood and stuff like that, and they help build David's palace in Jerusalem. So David sort of establishes himself in Jerusalem as the king, and then um, we hear of a story sort of mixed in between here, which is going to come up later, and it's a very short story about Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth is the son of Jonathan, who was David's brother in all intents and purposes, except for through blood. Um, and what happens with this boy, and this is going to come up more later, not for a few chapters, but it's still important for us to understand, is that David still has a relationship with Jonathan even when he's dead, and that he wants to defend his children and treat them with love and respect. And we hear about the story of Mephibosheth, who his wet nurse, or his, we can say, the person that was sort of taking care of him, when they heard the news of Saul and Jonathan dying in battle, the wet nurse got sort of spooked and tried to flee. And when she was fleeing, she dropped him, and his feet became lame because of it. And that's just a little bit of context into what happens later on. But yeah, this is sort of the story of 2 Samuel 4 and 5, and a little bit of 6, honestly, where David establishes himself as king. Ishbosheth is now no longer in the picture, and David is king of all of Israel, and he has a really good consolidation of power. I hope this was helpful, and I will be seeing you very, very soon in school on Monday. Very excited. Have a good day.